A young boy sits silently in a crowded courtroom, surrounded by strangers who are supposed to protect him. The defense lawyer calls him to the stand, confident that his silence will shield the truth. But when this timid boy utters just one word, and the entire courtroom erupts. The judge immediately locks down the room, demanding answers. What horrifying secrets does this child's plea uncover? And how far will one judge go to protect him against a system that failed him? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The wooden benches creaked as Maggie Bell shifted in her seat at the back of the courtroom. The air felt heavy, filled with the steady hum of the ancient ceiling fan and Mr. Bradley's self-assured voice. She gripped her worn leather notebook tighter, her fingers tracing the dog-eared corners of pages filled with careful observations and troubling details. The leather was smooth from years of handling, its familiar texture offering small comfort in the tense atmosphere. Her eyes drifted to Jamie, sitting 3 rows ahead. His small shoulders were hunched under a faded blue t-shirt that seemed a size too big. Dark hair fell across his forehead, nearly hiding his downcast eyes. His feet, clad in scuffed sneakers with fraying laces, didn't quite reach the floor. Every few minutes, he would swing them slightly, then catch himself and freeze, as if remembering where he was. Oak Hill Foster Home has maintained an exemplary record for over 15 years, Mr. Bradley announced, his voice carrying an edge of smugness. Our inspection reports consistently show full compliance with all state regulations. He adjusted his tie with manicured fingers, a gold ring catching the harsh fluorescent light. Maggie's jaw clenched. Her notebook told a different story, one written in careful dates and times, in observations made during her weekly visits as a volunteer advocate. She glanced down at her neat handwriting. March 15th, Jamie's right arm shows finger-shaped bruises. April 2nd, Jamie flinches when Greg raises his voice during dinner. April 10th, children eat alone in the kitchen while foster parents watch TV. Each entry was punctuated with precise times, locations, and witnesses when available. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Mr. Bradley continued his defense. Any allegations of neglect are completely unfounded and, frankly, offensive to the dedicated foster parents who give so much of themselves. His voice dripped with condescension as he gestured toward Greg and Susan. Greg and Susan sat rigidly in the front row, their backs straight as boards. Susan's fingers drummed against her purse, a nervous rhythm that seemed to echo through the quiet courtroom. Greg's neck was red above his collar, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Sweat beaded at his hairline despite the room's cool temperature. Other children from Oak Hill were scattered throughout the courtroom, sitting with caseworkers or temporary guardians. A small girl in a pink dress stared at her shoes, while a boy about Jamie's age picked at a loose thread on his sleeve. None of them looked up, their bodies held still as statues. The silence among them spoke volumes to Maggie's trained eye. Jamie's small fingers worked at the corner of his own notebook, a thin spiral-bound pad he carried everywhere. Maggie had never seen him without it. Sometimes during her visits, she'd catch glimpses of his drawings, detailed sketches of shadows and corners, of closed doors and empty rooms. They spoke more clearly than any words he couldn't say. Today, his pencil lay untouched beside the pad. Mr. Bradley shuffled his papers importantly. Furthermore, the allegations brought by Mrs. Bell are clearly the result of an overactive imagination, and perhaps a misguided sense of purpose. She's a volunteer, not a trained professional, and her observations should be weighted accordingly. He emphasized the word volunteer with barely concealed disdain. Maggie felt her cheeks flush but kept her expression neutral. In her lap, her notebook contained more than just observations. There were photographs, documented conversations with teachers, and reports from Jamie's school about unexplained absences and concerning behavior. Each piece of evidence was carefully organized, dated, and cross-referenced. The judge, a woman with steel gray hair and sharp eyes, listened with an unreadable expression. Her gaze occasionally moved between the different parties, taking in Greg and Susan's rigid postures, Jamie's bowed head, and the other silent children. Her fingers tapped thoughtfully against her desk as she made occasional notes. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," the judge announced, cutting through Mr. Bradley's monologue. We'll resume with Mrs. Bell's testimony afterward." The sharp rap of her gavel echoed through the chamber. As people began to stir, Maggie watched Greg and Susan lean toward Jamie. Susan's whispered words were harsh, her fingers digging into Jamie's shoulder. Greg loomed over them both, his shadow falling across Jamie's small form. The boy seemed to shrink even further into himself, his shoulders tensing visibly. Maggie's hands tightened around her notebook. She drew in a deep breath, preparing herself for what was to come. The weight of Jamie's future pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she straightened her spine, ready to fight for the truth that filled the pages in her hands. The courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet as everyone returned from recess. Maggie smoothed her notebook pages with trembling fingers, ready to present her carefully documented evidence. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across worried faces. The air felt thick with anticipation, heavy with unspoken fears. Mr. Bradley stood, adjusting his tie with practiced confidence, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the worn wooden furnishings. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call an unexpected witness." He paused for effect, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, a hint of satisfaction in his tone. "We call Jamie Foster to the stand." Maggie's breath caught in her throat, her heart skipping several beats. Her fingers gripped the wooden bench so hard her knuckles turned white, the polished surface smooth beneath her clenched hands. Around her, whispers rippled through the spectators like wind through dry leaves, a susurration of shock and concern. Jamie sat frozen, his small notebook clutched against his chest like a shield, his favorite dinosaur stickers barely visible on its cover. Greg and Susan exchanged quick glances, their faces tight with barely contained tension, a silent conversation passing between them. Greg's hand landed heavily on Jamie's shoulder, pushing him to stand, the boy's slight frame flinching at the contact. The bailiff approached, his footsteps echoing in the silent courtroom like distant thunder. He guided Jamie toward the witness stand with gentle movements, his weathered face softening as he helped the boy climb onto the tall chair. Jamie looked impossibly small behind the wooden barrier, his feet dangling inches above the floor, his worn sneakers swaying slightly. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly, his stern expression softening as he addressed the boy, crow's feet crinkling at the corners of his eyes. "Jamie, do you understand where you are?" Jamie's slight nod was barely perceptible, like a leaf trembling in a gentle breeze. His fingers worked at the corner of his notebook, creating tiny dog ears in the paper, a nervous habit Maggie had noticed months ago. "Proceed, Mr. Bradley," Judge Hayes directed, his tone carrying a note of caution, his eyes never leaving Jamie's small form. Mr. Bradley approached the witness stand, his shoes clicking against the polished floor with measured precision. "Jamie, I just have a few simple questions about your time at Oak Hill." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold and calculating. "Are you happy there?" Jamie stared at the microphone in front of him, its black metal seeming to loom over his small frame like a threatening shadow. His eyes darted to Greg and Susan, who sat rigid in their seats, their faces hard masks of warning, their bodies coiled with tension. Maggie held her breath, her heart pounding so loud she was sure everyone could hear it echoing off the courthouse walls. She watched Jamie's shoulders tremble beneath his oversized t-shirt, the fabric rippling with each shallow breath. The silence stretched, broken only by the steady tick of the wall clock, each second falling like a heavy drop of water. Mr. Bradley opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could, Jamie leaned forward. His lips barely brushed the microphone as he whispered a single word: "Help." The word seemed to hang in the air for a heartbeat before chaos erupted, like a dam breaking under too much pressure. Greg shot to his feet, his chair scraping backward with a harsh screech that cut through the air like a knife. Susan's shrill voice cut through the growing commotion, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing wildly. "He doesn't know what he's saying!" "Order!" Judge Hayes's gavel crashed down, the sharp crack silencing the room like a thunderclap. His eyes, suddenly fierce, locked onto Jamie, all pretense of gentleness gone. "Young man, can you clarify what you mean?" Jamie hunched lower in his seat, trembling visibly now, like a small animal caught in a trap, His notebook slipped from his fingers, landing on the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the tense silence. "Bailiffs, secure the exits," Judge Hayes commanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "No one leaves this courtroom." He turned to the court officers, his face set in stone. "I want an immediate investigation into this child's claim." Greg and Susan huddled with Mr. Bradley, their harsh whispers carrying undertones of panic, their bodies forming a tight circle of desperation. "This is ridiculous," Greg hissed, spittle flying from his lips. "He's just confused." Court officers moved swiftly toward Jamie, their faces professionally neutral but their eyes alert and watchful. Maggie rose halfway from her seat, her protective instincts screaming to reach him, her arms aching to hold him close, but an officer held up a warning hand. She watched helplessly as they escorted Jamie from the witness stand, his small form disappearing through a side door, his forgotten notebook lying abandoned on the courtroom floor. Judge Hayes's gavel struck once more, the sound final and decisive. "This court is in recess. I want every relevant child services worker in my chambers immediately." His voice carried the weight of authority and barely contained anger, years of experience telling him something was deeply wrong. "And someone get me everything we have on Oak Hill Foster Home. Everything." His last word hung in the air like a promise of justice to come. The courthouse hallway stretched endlessly before Maggie as she paced, her footsteps echoing against the marble floors. Every few steps, she glanced at the heavy wooden door where Jamie sat with the court officers and child advocate. Her hands fidgeted with her jacket buttons, a nervous habit she'd never quite broken. Through the door's frosted glass panel, she could make out shadowy figures moving inside. The muffled voices carried no words, only tones, gentle, encouraging, patient. But no response came from Jamie. Maggie knew that silence well. It was his shield, his protection against a world that had given him too many reasons to be afraid. Down the hall, Greg and Susan's voices rose in sharp contrast. "This is absolutely ridiculous." Greg's face had turned an alarming shade of red as he jabbed his finger at Mr. Bradley's chest. "Fix this." "Lower your voice," Mr. Bradley hissed, straightening his tie. "This isn't helping your case." Susan's perfectly manicured nails dug into Greg's arm as she pulled him aside. "He's confused," she insisted, her voice carrying a desperate edge. "That's all we need to say. Children get confused all the time." Maggie watched their performance with growing unease. Their behavior reminded her of cornered animals, dangerous in their desperation. She'd seen similar reactions before in her years of advocacy work, and it only strengthened her resolve to protect Jamie. When the court finally reconvened, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Judge Hayes sat at his bench, his expression grave as he reviewed the preliminary reports before him. Jamie sat in a chair near the bench, his small frame almost disappearing into the oversized seat. His notebook remained clutched to his chest like armor. "After careful consideration of the circumstances," Judge Hayes began, his voice filling the courtroom, "I am ordering the temporary removal of the minor, James Walker, from the custody of his current foster parents pending a full investigation." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "This court takes allegations of abuse or neglect with the utmost seriousness." Greg started to rise, but Mr. Bradley's hand shot out, keeping him seated. Susan's face had gone pale, her lips pressed into a thin white line. "Your Honor," Maggie spoke up, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "As Jamie's court-appointed advocate, I'm familiar with his case and his needs. I'm willing to provide temporary care during the investigation." Judge Hayes considered this, looking between Maggie and Jamie. The boy had lifted his head slightly at the sound of her voice, though his eyes remained fixed on his notebook. "Given Ms. Bell's established relationship with the child and her qualified background, I approve this temporary arrangement." The judge's gavel fell with finality. "Court officers will escort Ms. Bell and the child to collect his immediate necessities from Oak Hill." As Maggie approached Jamie, she could feel Greg and Susan's glares burning into her back. But her focus remained entirely on the small boy before her, his shoulders hunched under the weight of the day's events. She extended her hand slowly, giving him time to accept or reject the gesture. Jamie's small hand slipped into hers, trembling slightly but holding on. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were wide with a mix of fear and uncertainty that made her heart ache. Maggie gave his hand a gentle squeeze and smiled warmly, her voice soft but firm as she said, "You're safe now." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Maggie's living room windows as she unlocked her front door, Jamie's small hand still tucked in hers. Her modest two-bedroom home, with its worn but comfortable furniture and walls lined with cheerful photographs of gardens and seaside scenes, had never felt more important than it did at this moment. "This is home for now," Maggie said softly, watching Jamie take in his surroundings. His eyes darted from corner to corner, as if mapping escape routes, lingering on the windows and the back door visible through the kitchen. The worn notebook remained clutched tightly against his chest, his knuckles white from gripping it, the edges slightly frayed from constant handling. "Would you like to see your room?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle and steady, the way she used to speak to frightened children in the hospital. Jamie gave a barely perceptible nod, following her down the short hallway with careful, measured steps. Maggie had spent the courthouse recess calling her neighbor Martha, asking her to prepare the guest room. The result was better than she'd hoped. Fresh sheets with blue stripes, fluffy pillows, and a plush teddy bear sitting expectantly on the bed. Martha had even added a small nightlight that cast soft stars on the ceiling. "Martha found this fellow at the store," Maggie explained, picking up the honey-colored bear with its warm brown eyes and red bow tie. "He needed a home too." She placed it back carefully, noticing how Jamie's eyes followed her movements, his fingers twitching slightly toward the stuffed animal before retreating. In the kitchen, Maggie busied herself preparing a simple dinner of chicken soup and crackers, the familiar routine helping to settle her own nerves. She stole glances at Jamie, who had settled cross-legged in the corner of the living room, his back pressed firmly against the wall. His pencil moved steadily across the pages of his notebook, the scratching sound the only noise besides the quiet bubbling of the soup and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. "Dinner's ready whenever you're hungry," she announced, setting 2 bowls on the small kitchen table, making sure to place Jamie's bowl at the seat with the clearest view of both exits. Jamie didn't respond, but his pencil paused briefly before continuing its dance across the paper, pressing harder now, leaving darker marks. As the evening progressed, Jamie barely touched his soup, taking only the smallest sips when Maggie wasn't looking directly at him, his spoon barely disturbing the surface of the broth. She occupied herself with quiet tasks, washing dishes, folding laundry, arranging Jamie's few belongings in his room, all while keeping him in her peripheral vision, noting how he tensed at sudden movements or sounds from outside. When the dishes were done, Maggie sat in her armchair with a book, though her eyes weren't following the words. Instead, she watched as Jamie's drawings took shape, each stroke of his pencil seeming more urgent than the last. From where she sat, she could make out dark, angular forms filling the pages, spreading like shadows across the white paper. Curious, she moved closer, keeping her movements slow and telegraphed like approaching a nervous cat. The images made her heart clench. Shadowy rooms with corners that seemed to writhe with darkness, looming figures with eyes that seemed to glare from the paper, their hands reaching menacingly across the page. The technical skill was remarkable for a 7-year-old, but the subject matter told a story that made Maggie's throat tight with concern, her hands itching to reach out and comfort him. "Those are very powerful drawings," she said quietly, careful to keep her voice neutral despite the worry churning in her stomach. Jamie's hand stilled, his fingers trembling slightly around the pencil. "You can show me more when you're ready. No rush." His shoulders, which had begun to hunch defensively, relaxed slightly at her words, though his grip on the notebook didn't loosen. As night fell, Jamie's eyes grew heavy, though he fought to keep them open, blinking hard against his exhaustion. Maggie led him to his room, where he crawled into bed still fully dressed, his shoes leaving small smudges on the clean sheets. His notebook remained tucked securely under his pillow, one corner visible beneath the striped pillowcase. She sat in the reading chair by the window, watching as his breathing eventually evened out into sleep, his small fists gradually unclenching. Looking at his small form curled protectively around his notebook, Maggie made a silent vow. I won't let them hurt you again." The promise felt heavy and real in the quiet room, as solid as the moonlight streaming through the window and as binding as any oath she'd ever taken. She settled deeper into the chair, preparing for a long night of watchful waiting, knowing that first nights were always the hardest. The morning sun painted golden stripes across Maggie's kitchen floor as she stood by the window, coffee mug warming her hands. Her mind raced with plans and worries while she watched the neighborhood come alive. Mrs. Peterson next door watered her roses, and the familiar rhythm of everyday life felt oddly comforting against the weight of what lay ahead. The smell of fresh coffee and toast lingered in the air, a reminder of the simple breakfast she'd prepared, hoping Jamie might eat more than just a few bites. Maggie padded quietly down the hallway, her socked feet silent on the wooden floor, pausing at Jamie's door. Through the slight opening, she could see him curled up like a small comma on the bed, his notebook pressed against his chest even in sleep. The teddy bear lay untouched beside him, its hopeful button eyes staring at the ceiling. Her heart ached at how tightly he held onto that worn notebook, as if it contained all his secrets and safety. She watched his peaceful breathing for a moment, grateful he'd managed to sleep through the night without nightmares. Back in the kitchen, Maggie pulled out her phone and dialed Grace Townsend's number, her fingers slightly trembling with anticipation. Grace had been her friend for 15 years, ever since they'd worked together on a community outreach program at the local hospital. If anyone could help navigate this situation, it would be Grace, with her decades of experience in child services and unwavering dedication to helping kids in need. "Maggie," Grace answered on the second ring, her voice warm but professional. "I've been expecting your call. Can you come in this morning? I've cleared my schedule." By mid-morning, Maggie and Jamie sat in Grace's office at the Department of Child Services. The space was deliberately welcoming, with colorful artwork on the walls and a small table with crayons and paper in the corner. Soft light filtered through gauzy curtains, and a small desk fountain provided gentle background noise. Jamie immediately gravitated to the activity corner, setting up his notebook while the adults talked, his shoulders visibly relaxing in the calm environment. Grace spread several files across her desk, her normally cheerful face grave, worry lines creasing her forehead. "The financial records don't add up," she explained in a low voice, mindful of Jamie's presence. "Oak Hill has been receiving full government stipends for each child, but look at these expense reports." She pointed to column after column of numbers, her finger tracing the troubling patterns. Basic necessities, food, clothing, educational supplies, all drastically under budget. The money's going somewhere, but not to the children's care. Maggie leaned forward, her coffee forgotten and growing cold beside her. "How long has this been going on?" "At least 3 years," Grace replied, shuffling through more papers, each one revealing new discrepancies. "But that's just what we can prove. The really concerning part is how they've managed to avoid detection during inspections. Someone's been helping them cover their tracks, someone with influence." They both glanced at Jamie, who was bent over his notebook, pencil moving steadily across the page, his small face focused in concentration. Grace lowered her voice further. "The fact that he spoke up in court yesterday, even just that one word, it's unprecedented. These kids are usually too terrified to say anything. They've learned to stay silent." "He hasn't spoken since," Maggie admitted, watching Jamie draw with practiced strokes. "But he's showing trust in other ways. This morning, he actually ate a few bites of breakfast. Yesterday, he wouldn't even look at the food." Grace nodded thoughtfully, her eyes softening. "That's significant. Children who've experienced trauma like this rarely trust adults. The fact that he's responding to you at all suggests he sees you as safe." She paused, her expression serious as she leaned closer across the desk. "But Maggie, be careful. The defense will try to discredit both of you. They've got too much to lose, and people with money and power rarely go down without a fight." As they left Grace's office later, Maggie noticed how Jamie's eyes darted nervously at every passing stranger in the hallway, his body tensing at sudden movements or loud voices. His small hand found hers, fingers cold with anxiety, and she gave it a reassuring squeeze. "We'll figure this out together," she said softly, her voice steady and calm. Jamie's fingers tightened around hers in response, a silent acknowledgement of trust that meant more than words could say. In that simple gesture, Maggie felt both the weight of his faith in her and her determination to prove worthy of it. The kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of chicken soup as Maggie stirred the pot, adding another pinch of salt. She glanced over at Jamie, who sat hunched over his notebook at the kitchen table. His small hand moved quickly across the paper, his dark eyebrows furrowed in concentration. The scratch of his pencil against paper was the only sound besides the gentle bubbling of the soup. "Would you like some juice, Jamie?" Maggie asked softly, keeping her voice light and steady. Jamie didn't look up, but his hand paused briefly before continuing its urgent work. Maggie took that as a no and returned to stirring the soup. She began humming "You Are My Sunshine," a song her mother used to sing to her. The familiar melody helped calm her own nerves as she watched Jamie from the corner of her eye. His shoulders were tense, his whole body rigid as he drew, as if preparing to defend himself at any moment. The evening passed quietly. Jamie barely touched his soup, though Maggie noticed he did drink some water. She didn't push him to eat more, understanding that trust would take time to build. Later that night, a piercing scream jolted Maggie from her sleep. Her heart pounding, she threw off her covers and ran to Jamie's room. The boy was thrashing wildly in his bed, his blankets twisted around his small body like ropes. "Jamie, Jamie, sweetheart, wake up," Maggie called out, reaching for him carefully. "You're safe. It's just a dream." She gently touched his shoulder, and his eyes flew open, wide with terror. For a moment, he stared at her uncomprehendingly. Then his face crumpled, and he launched himself into her arms, his whole body shaking with sobs. Maggie held him close, rocking slightly as she stroked his back. His tears soaked through her nightgown, but she didn't mind. As Jamie's sobs gradually quieted to hiccups, Maggie noticed his notebook lying open on the floor, having fallen from the bed during his nightmare. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated the pages, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The drawings were done in stark black pencil, bare rooms with bars across windows, empty beds with shadowy figures looming nearby. One particularly disturbing sketch showed small figures huddled in corners, while tall, menacing shapes stood over them. The images spoke of fear, loneliness, and helplessness. Jamie followed her gaze to the notebook but made no move to explain or hide the drawings. His small body trembled against hers. "You're safe now," Maggie whispered, holding him closer. "I promise, you're safe." She continued to hold him, gently rocking, until his breathing steadied and his body relaxed into sleep. Maggie sat on the edge of his bed, watching his face in the moonlight. Even in sleep, a slight furrow remained between his eyebrows, as if he couldn't fully escape his fears. The notebook lay open on the floor, its pages filled with the dark memories that haunted Jamie's dreams. The morning sun had barely risen when Maggie's phone rang, startling her as she prepared breakfast. Grace's urgent voice came through the speaker. "Maggie, Judge Hayes called an emergency hearing. He wants to address the Oak Hill situation immediately." Maggie glanced at Jamie, who sat at the kitchen table pushing scrambled eggs around his plate. "What time?" 9 o'clock sharp. The defense is pushing back hard. They're trying to dismiss Jamie's testimony entirely." After hanging up, Maggie approached Jamie with a gentle smile. "Hey, sweetie, we need to go back to the courthouse today." Jamie's shoulders tensed, but he nodded slowly. She helped him into a clean blue sweater she'd bought him yesterday, noting how his thin frame seemed to swim in even the smallest size. The courthouse buzzed with activity when they arrived. Mr. Bradley, the defense attorney, paced near the entrance, his face red with barely contained anger. He shot Maggie a cold glare as she guided Jamie past him. Inside the courtroom, Judge Hayes sat straight-backed at his bench, his expression grave. Mr. Bradley immediately launched into his argument, his voice sharp with indignation. "Your Honor, we cannot allow the entire reputation of Oak Hill to be tarnished based on one child's single word. Furthermore, Ms. Bell's position as temporary guardian is questionable at best. She's a volunteer with no professional credentials in childcare." Maggie stood when called upon, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Your Honor, I've documented every concerning incident I witnessed at Oak Hill." She pulled out Jamie's notebook, carefully opening it to the most telling drawings. These sketches tell a story that Jamie hasn't been able to voice. Dark rooms, locked doors, threatening figures. Mr. Bradley interrupted. Drawings? Your Honor, surely you're not considering children's artwork as evidence? Judge Hayes raised his hand for silence. Mr. Bradley, in cases involving traumatized children, we must consider all forms of communication. He studied the drawings carefully, his expression darkening. Maggie continued, describing the bruises she'd noticed on Jamie and other children, the way they flinched at loud noises, their constant fear. Jamie sat beside her, his eyes fixed on his hands folded in his lap, but she could feel him leaning slightly toward her. After hearing both sides, Judge Hayes cleared his throat. The evidence presented, including Jamie's testimony and Ms. Bell's documentation, raises serious concerns about the conditions at Oak Hill. I'm ordering the immediate temporary relocation of all children currently housed there. Furthermore, I'm scheduling a full public hearing in 2 weeks to address these issues comprehensively. Mr. Bradley sputtered in protest, but Judge Hayes remained firm. The safety of these children is paramount. This court will not ignore potential abuse simply because the victims are too frightened to speak. As they left the courthouse, Maggie gently placed her hand on Jamie's shoulder. We're one step closer, she said softly. Jamie walked beside her, his steps lighter than before, though he remained silent. His shoulders, usually so tense, had relaxed just slightly under her touch. The evening light cast long shadows through Maggie's kitchen windows as she stirred a pot of homemade chicken soup. The gentle aroma filled the house, creating a cozy atmosphere that seemed to help Jamie relax. He sat at the wooden kitchen table, his colored pencils spread out before him as he worked intently on a new drawing. Maggie noticed something different about his artwork today. While the familiar dark elements remained, shadowy corners and stern faces, there were now hints of brightness breaking through. In one sketch, a window let in rays of sunshine. In another, a small figure stood beneath what looked like a protective arch of light. Would you like some soup, Jamie? Maggie asked softly. He nodded without looking up, completely absorbed in his work. As she placed the warm bowl beside him, she caught glimpses of his current drawing. The details were remarkable for a 7-year-old. After dinner, while Maggie loaded the dishwasher, she felt a gentle tug on her sleeve. Jamie stood there, holding his notebook with both hands. His eyes met hers briefly before dropping to the floor, but he held out the notebook insistently. The drawing took Maggie's breath away. It showed Oak Hill foster home in precise detail, the Victorian architecture, the weathered shutters, even the crack in the third step leading to the front door. But what caught her attention was something she'd never noticed during her visits. Behind the main staircase, Jamie had drawn a door, partially hidden by what appeared to be a false panel. Jamie, she whispered, kneeling down to his level. Is this a special room at Oak Hill? He nodded, his fingers nervously playing with the hem of his sweater. Maggie's mind raced. If there was indeed a hidden room, what secrets might it hold? She reached for her phone, her hands slightly shaking as she dialed Grace's number. While waiting for an answer, she gave Jamie's shoulder a gentle squeeze. Grace, you need to see this, Maggie said when her friend picked up. Jamie's drawn something important. After a brief conversation with Grace, she dialed Tom Rivera's number. The investigative journalist had been following the Oak Hill case closely, and Maggie knew his expertise would be crucial. Jamie watched her make the calls, his eyes wide and attentive. When she finished, she sat beside him at the table. Your drawings are helping us understand, Jamie. They're very important. She pointed to the hidden door in his sketch. This might help other kids too. A small nod from Jamie, but this time his eyes stayed on hers a moment longer. She saw a flicker of something there, perhaps pride or relief at being believed. Later, as Maggie tucked Jamie into bed, pulling his new blue comforter up to his chin, she noticed another drawing on his nightstand. This one showed 2 figures, one small, one tall, standing together. Even without details, she recognized herself and Jamie. We'll figure this out together, she promised, smoothing his hair. Jamie's hand found hers in the dim light, giving it a small squeeze before letting go. The morning sun had barely risen when Maggie's phone buzzed. Tom Rivera's name flashed on the screen, and she answered quickly, keeping her voice low to avoid waking Jamie. "I've got the warrant," Tom said. "We can check out Oak Hill today. Grace is already on board." Maggie glanced toward the guest room where Jamie slept. "Perfect. Let me just make sure Jamie's okay before we head out." She found Jamie already awake, sitting cross-legged on his bed with his notebook open. His pencil moved swiftly across the page, adding careful details to a new drawing. When he heard her footsteps, he looked up, his eyes wide with concern. "I need to go check something at Oak Hill," Maggie explained gently. "I'll be very careful, and I'll be back before you know it." Jamie's hands trembled slightly as he tore the page from his notebook. The drawing showed more details of the hidden room, heavy locks mounted on the inside of the door, a small window covered with thick curtains, and what appeared to be narrow beds pushed against the walls. At Oak Hill, the morning air felt heavy and still. Maggie parked next to Grace's car where Tom was already setting up his camera equipment. The building loomed before them, its windows like dark eyes staring down. "This way," Maggie whispered, holding Jamie's drawing as a guide. Their footsteps echoed through empty hallways, past closed doors and peeling wallpaper. The staircase matched Jamie's sketch perfectly, a steep wooden structure with worn treads. Beneath it, partially hidden behind a false panel, they found the door. Grace pulled out a flashlight while Tom documented everything with his camera. The room behind the door made Maggie's stomach turn. 3 broken bed frames were pushed against the walls, their thin mattresses stained and torn. Soiled blankets lay crumpled in corners. A large cabinet stood against the far wall, secured with a heavy padlock. Grace managed to break the lock open. Inside, they found boxes of unopened food and supplies, items meant for the children but never distributed. Tom's camera clicked rapidly, capturing every detail. "This is illegal entry." The sharp voice made them all jump. Mr. Landry, the home's inspector, stood in the doorway, his face red with anger. "You have no right to be here." Grace stepped forward, her voice steady. "Actually, we do. Judge Hayes authorized this inspection following evidence of neglect and abuse." "You can't prove anything," Landry snarled, blocking the doorway. "This is private property." "Move aside," Tom said firmly, his camera still recording. "Or would you like to explain to the judge why you're interfering with a court-ordered investigation?" Landry's face paled slightly, but his eyes blazed with fury. After a tense moment, he stepped back, allowing them to exit with their evidence. They walked quickly to their cars, Tom carefully protecting his camera. Grace made several calls to her office, documenting their findings. Maggie's heart pounded as she thought of Jamie and all the other children who had suffered in that hidden room. In Tom's car, they reviewed the photos, stark images that told a story of systematic neglect and cruelty. "This will prove everything," Maggie said quietly, her voice heavy with the weight of their discovery. The morning sun streamed through Maggie's kitchen window as her phone buzzed with Tom Rivera's call. Her heart quickened as she answered, keeping her voice low to avoid disturbing Jamie in the next room. "We've got everything in place," Tom said, his voice tight with urgency. "Grace secured the warrant. We can inspect Oak Hill today." Maggie glanced at the clock, 7:15 a.m. "I'll need 15 minutes to get Jamie settled," she replied, already moving toward the guest room. She found Jamie sitting cross-legged on his bed, hunched over his notebook. His small fingers gripped his pencil tightly as he added careful details to a new drawing. When she entered, he looked up with worried eyes. "Jamie, sweetheart," Maggie said softly, sitting on the edge of his bed. "I need to go check something at Oak Hill. Mrs. Anderson from next door will stay with you for a little while." She touched his shoulder gently. "I promise I'll be careful and I'll come back as soon as I can." Jamie's hands trembled slightly as he tore the page from his notebook. The new drawing showed more details of the hidden room than before. Heavy locks mounted on the inside of the door, a small window with thick curtains drawn tight, and narrow beds pushed against the walls. In one corner, he'd drawn a large cabinet with multiple padlocks. The drive to Oak Hill felt endless. Grace met them in her official car, her face set with determination. Tom checked his camera equipment one last time as they approached the building's entrance. Inside, their footsteps echoed through empty hallways. The morning light struggled to penetrate the grimy windows, casting long shadows across worn carpets. The air felt thick with neglect and secrets. Following Jamie's drawing, they located the main staircase. Tom's flashlight beam revealed a subtle seam in the wall beneath it. Grace ran her fingers along the edge until she found a hidden latch. The door creaked open to reveal exactly what Jamie had drawn. The small room smelled of mold and fear. 3 broken bed frames lined the walls, their thin mattresses stained and torn. Tom's camera clicked rapidly, documenting everything. "Over here," Grace whispered, pointing to the cabinet Jamie had drawn. Its padlocks were new and heavy, a stark contrast to the room's general decay. Before they could investigate further, heavy footsteps approached. Mr. Landry, the facility inspector, burst into the room, his face red with anger. "This is private property," he shouted. "You have no right to be here." Grace stepped forward, her voice steady. "We have a warrant signed by Judge Hayes." She held up the document. "Any attempt to interfere with this investigation will result in immediate legal action." Mr. Landry's face paled slightly, but he continued to block the doorway. "These are routine storage areas. Nothing more." "Storage areas don't need inside locks," Tom noted quietly, his camera still clicking. The standoff lasted several tense minutes before Mr. Landry finally stepped aside, muttering about lawyers and consequences. They worked quickly after that, gathering their evidence. In Tom's car afterward, Maggie studied the photos on his camera display. Her hands shook slightly as she scrolled through images that confirmed Jamie's every drawing. "This will prove everything," she murmured, thinking of the small boy waiting at home who had been brave enough to show them the truth. The morning sun filtered through Maggie's kitchen curtains as she spread the local newspaper across the breakfast table. Jamie sat quietly beside her, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate with his fork. The headline blazed across the front page. "Hidden Horrors Investigation Reveals Years of Abuse at Oak Hill Foster Home." "Would you like me to read it to you?" Maggie asked gently. Jamie nodded, his eyes fixed on his plate. As Maggie read Tom's carefully crafted words, she paused occasionally to explain complex terms in simple language Jamie could understand. The article detailed everything: the hidden room beneath the stairs, the withheld supplies, and the pattern of neglect that had gone unchecked for years. Tom had handled Jamie's involvement sensitively, never naming him directly but acknowledging the brave child whose testimony had sparked the investigation. By mid-morning, Maggie's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Local advocacy groups pledged their support, offering resources and legal assistance. But between the supportive calls came darker messages, anonymous voices warning her to back off and mind her own business. "We expected this," Tom assured her over the phone. "These people have a lot to lose. Just stay alert and document everything." Grace called shortly after, her voice tight with concern. "I'm sending a security team to do a sweep of your house," she said. "We're installing cameras and additional locks today. No arguments." Throughout the day, Jamie grew increasingly tense as more news vans appeared on their street. He flinched at every car door slam and kept checking the windows. His drawings became darker again, filled with shadowy figures peering through glass. Maggie found him hiding under his bed after a particularly loud group of reporters knocked on their door. She crawled down beside him, careful to give him space. "I know this is scary," she said softly, "but what we're doing is right. Those people at Oak Hill, they can't hurt any more children now. You helped make that happen with your bravery." Jamie looked at her with wide eyes, clutching his notebook to his chest. "I promise you're safe here," Maggie continued. "Grace is sending people to make our house even safer, and I won't let anyone hurt you, not ever again." The security team arrived that afternoon, installing cameras and reinforced locks while Jamie watched from behind the curtains. Grace supervised the entire process, taking notes and coordinating with local police to increase patrols in the neighborhood. "The publicity will die down," Grace assured Maggie, "but the truth needed to come out. You both did the right thing." As evening fell, Maggie noticed Jamie's shoulders gradually relaxing as the street grew quieter. He settled into his usual spot at the kitchen table, starting a new drawing while Maggie prepared dinner. The house felt more secure now, a fortress protecting them both from those who wished to silence the truth. That night, as Maggie tucked Jamie into bed, she smoothed his hair back and said softly, "The truth is out now. They can't hide anymore." Jamie nodded, holding his notebook tightly as his eyes drifted closed, finally finding rest after the tumultuous day. The morning air was crisp as Maggie helped Jamie into her car, his notebook clutched tightly against his chest. She'd spent extra time that morning making sure he felt comfortable, letting him pick out his favorite blue sweater and fixing his preferred breakfast of chocolate chip pancakes. Every small choice helped him feel more in control. "Dr. Reed is very nice," Maggie explained softly as they drove. "She helps lots of kids just like you." Jamie stared out the window, his fingers tracing the spiral binding of his notebook. The therapy office was painted in warm, soothing colors, with cheerful artwork decorating the walls. Despite the welcoming atmosphere, Jamie's grip on Maggie's hand tightened as they walked through the door. The waiting room had a small table with crayons and paper, but Jamie held onto his own notebook, unwilling to let go. Dr. Anna Reed emerged from her office with a gentle smile. She had kind eyes and moved with careful, deliberate gestures that seemed to put children at ease. "Hello, Jamie," she said warmly, kneeling down to his eye level. "I love your notebook. Do you like to draw?" Jamie nodded almost imperceptibly, still pressed against Maggie's side. "Would you like to come draw with me? We have lots of nice art supplies in my office." Dr. Reed gestured to the bright, sunny room behind her. After a moment's hesitation and an encouraging squeeze from Maggie, Jamie followed Dr. Reed into her office. Maggie settled into a chair in the waiting room, her heart aching as she watched the door close. During the session, Maggie could occasionally hear the soft murmur of Dr. Reed's voice through the door. She found herself remembering how far Jamie had come already, from that first terrified whisper in the courtroom to the quiet trust he now showed her. Her thoughts were interrupted when Dr. Reed opened the door, inviting her in to talk while Jamie continued drawing at a small table. Dr. Reed showed Maggie the drawing Jamie had made, a small figure huddled in a dark room, heavy bars casting shadows across the page. "He's expressing his experiences through his art," Dr. Reed explained quietly. "This is actually very positive. He's finding ways to process what happened to him." Jamie looked up briefly at their whispered conversation before returning to his drawing. "Give him time," Dr. Reed advised Maggie. "He's already showing signs of feeling safer with you. That's crucial for his healing process." As they prepared to leave, Jamie carefully tore a page from his notebook. He hesitated for a moment before handing it to Maggie. There, in the corner of an otherwise blank page, was a tiny heart drawn in red crayon. Maggie felt tears welling up in her eyes as she looked at the simple drawing. "You're so brave, Jamie," she whispered. His small hand found hers, squeezing it tight in response. The morning sun cast long shadows through Grace's office window as Maggie settled into a chair, carefully arranging Jamie's latest drawings on the desk. Jamie sat quietly in the corner, his trusted notebook open on his lap, colored pencils scattered around him. "These drawings," Maggie said, pointing to the detailed sketches, "show more of what Jamie remembered about the hidden room. Look at how precise the details are, the locks, the cabinet positions, everything." Grace nodded, her expression grave as she spread out several manila folders across her desk. "Maggie, what I'm about to show you, it's bigger than we thought." She pulled out a series of documents, laying them side by side. "I've been digging through financial records following the money trail from Oak Hill." Maggie leaned forward, studying the papers. Her eyes widened as Grace pointed out various transactions and connections. "See these payments? They're being funneled through shell companies, but they all lead back to one source, Councilman Richard Graves." The name hung heavy in the air. Maggie felt her stomach tighten. Everyone knew Graves. He'd been on the city council for 15 years, controlling funding for social services and foster care programs. "Greg and Susan aren't just foster parents," Grace continued, her voice dropping lower. "They're longtime campaign donors to Graves. But it goes deeper. Look at these dates. Every time there was a complaint about Oak Hill, there's a corresponding payment to one of Graves's pet projects." Maggie's hands clenched into fists. "He's been burying the complaints all this time while children were suffering." Exactly, Grace said, shuffling through more papers. The foster parents get their government stipends, pocket most of it while neglecting the children, and kick back a portion to Graves through various charitable donations. It's a perfect circle of corruption. In the corner, Jamie's pencil moved steadily across his paper, adding more details to his drawing of the hidden room. The sound seemed to echo in the tense silence. "This explains why nothing was ever done," Maggie said, her voice tight with anger. "Every report, every concern just disappeared into thin air." Grace nodded grimly. "Graves chairs the committee that oversees foster care funding. He's been protecting Oak Hill because he's profiting from it." "But this is dangerous, Grace," Maggie warned, glancing at Jamie. "Graves has connections everywhere. If we go after him—" "That's why we need to be strategic," Grace replied, already pulling out a legal pad. "We need to present this evidence carefully at the public hearing. Everything needs to be documented, verified, and bulletproof." They spent the next hour organizing documents and planning their approach, while Jamie continued drawing, seemingly absorbed in his own world but occasionally glancing up at their intense discussion. As they prepared to leave, Maggie gathered Jamie's drawings and helped him collect his pencils. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, feeling protective and determined. "We're getting closer, Jamie. They won't get away with this." Jamie looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. In them, Maggie saw a tiny spark of hope beginning to shine through the fear. The kitchen was quiet except for the soft scratching of Jamie's pencil against paper. The evening sun cast warm shadows across the wooden table where he worked, his small face scrunched in concentration. Maggie watched him from the counter where she was preparing tea, noting how his hand moved with purpose, unlike his usually hesitant sketching. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Maggie asked softly, placing a glass of milk near him. Jamie nodded without looking up, his pencil moving faster now. After a few more minutes, he carefully placed his pencil down and slid the drawing across the table to Maggie. Her breath caught as she took in the details. The sketch showed the hidden room at Oak Hill with haunting clarity. Every shadow, every crack in the walls was meticulously rendered. In the center, a small figure huddled in the corner, tears visible on their face. The bars on the tiny window cast prison-like shadows across the floor. Jamie had even included the broken bed frame they'd discovered during their investigation. "This is very brave of you, Jamie," Maggie said, carefully keeping her voice steady despite the ache in her heart. She placed the drawing in a protective sleeve and added it to their growing file of evidence. Later that evening, as Maggie was washing dishes, Jamie tugged at her sleeve. He had another drawing. This one made her stomach turn. It showed a group of adults, their faces deliberately turned away, standing in a hallway. Behind them, through an open door, several children were crying. The adults' postures conveyed deliberate ignorance, their backs rigid with denial. "They knew," Maggie whispered, understanding Jamie's message. "They all knew, and did nothing." Jamie's small shoulders slumped, but his jaw was set with determination as he nodded. Maggie dried her hands and reached for her phone, dialing Tom's number. As she described the new drawings, she could hear him typing rapidly on his keyboard. "We need to organize these chronologically," Tom suggested, his voice urgent. "If we can show a pattern, dates, specific incidents, it'll be harder for them to dismiss. These aren't just drawings anymore, Maggie. They're evidence of systematic abuse." They spent the next hour planning how to present Jamie's artwork. Each sketch would be dated, annotated, and connected to specific incidents at Oak Hill. Jamie sat nearby, working on another drawing, occasionally glancing up at Maggie as if to ensure she was still there. When bedtime came, Maggie tucked Jamie into bed, carefully removing the pencil from his tired grip. "Your story is going to help so many kids," she promised softly. Jamie nodded, his eyes already heavy with sleep. The moonlight filtered through his window, casting a gentle glow on his face, finally peaceful in rest. His notebook lay open on the bedside table, filled with truth told in the only way he knew how. The courthouse buzzed with tension as people filed into every available seat. Reporters clutched their notepads, their pens poised to capture every detail. Community advocates whispered among themselves, their faces etched with determination. Maggie sat in the front row, her hand resting protectively on Jamie's shoulder as he held his sketchbook close to his chest like a shield. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Judge Hayes entered, his black robes swishing as he took his place at the bench. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise!" The shuffle of feet and rustle of clothing filled the air as everyone stood. "Be seated," Judge Hayes commanded, his stern gaze sweeping across the packed courtroom. "We're here today to address the allegations of abuse and negligence at Oak Hill Foster Home." Mr. Bradley rose from his seat, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his demeanor aggressive. "Your Honor, I must object to these proceedings. These allegations are based on nothing more than the imagination of a troubled child and the interference of an overzealous volunteer." Maggie felt Jamie tense beside her. She squeezed his shoulder gently, grounding him. "Ms. Bell," Bradley continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "has taken advantage of this situation for her own personal agenda. She's manipulated a vulnerable child's artwork to create sensational stories." The gallery murmured in disapproval, but Maggie remained composed as she stood. "Your Honor, if I may?" At the judge's nod, she began presenting Jamie's drawings. One by one, she showed them to the court, explaining how each detailed sketch corresponded exactly with what they'd found at Oak Hill. Gasps echoed through the courtroom as Maggie displayed the drawing of the hidden room. The precise details, the broken beds, the locked cabinet, even the peculiar crack in the wall, matched the photographic evidence perfectly. When Judge Hayes turned his attention to Jamie, Maggie knelt beside him. "Jamie, would you like to show the judge which drawing is most important to you?" Jamie's small hand trembled as he flipped through his sketchbook. He stopped at a particularly powerful image, a heavy door with multiple locks, behind which several small figures huddled in darkness. Without speaking, he pointed to the drawing, his finger pressing firmly against the paper. Judge Hayes leaned forward, studying the image intently. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Jamie's silent testimony hanging in the air. The judge's expression softened as he looked at Jamie, acknowledging the courage it took to share his story, even without words. After several more minutes of testimony, Judge Hayes straightened in his chair. "This hearing will continue tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, he announced firmly. "I intend to ensure that all responsible parties are held accountable for their actions." As people began filing out of the courtroom, Maggie gathered Jamie's drawings carefully. She could feel the first stirrings of hope, not just for Jamie, but for all the children who had suffered at Oak Hill. They made their way through the crowd, Jamie's hand firmly in hers, both knowing this was just one step in their journey toward justice. The morning sun streamed through Maggie's kitchen window as she whisked pancake batter, trying to create a sense of normalcy. Jamie sat at the table, carefully adding details to his latest drawing. The phone's sharp ring cut through the peaceful moment, making them both jump. "Ms. Bell?" Judge Hayes' secretary's crisp voice came through. "Please hold for Judge Hayes." Maggie's hand tightened on the phone as the judge's familiar voice filled the line. "Ms. Bell, I wanted to inform you personally of a development in Jamie's case. His biological parents, Sarah and Todd Miller, have come forward." The whisk clattered against the bowl as Maggie's hand went slack. I wasn't aware they were in the picture, Your Honor." "They've filed a petition for custody," Judge Hayes continued. "They've completed a rehabilitation program and are asserting their parental rights." Maggie glanced at Jamie, still absorbed in his drawing, unaware that his world might shift again. Her throat felt tight as she thanked the judge and hung up. Within the hour, she sat in Grace's office, the morning's pancakes forgotten. Grace spread out several files on her desk, showing documentation of Sarah and Todd's progress. "They've been clean for 8 months," Grace explained, her voice gentle. "They've maintained steady employment, completed parenting classes, and secured stable housing. On paper, they're doing everything right." Maggie ran her fingers through her hair. "But is it enough? After everything Jamie's been through?" "Mom?" Jamie's small voice made both women turn. He stood in the doorway, his sketchbook clutched to his chest, eyes wide with uncertainty. "Do I have to go away?" Maggie crossed the room quickly, kneeling before him. "No decisions have been made yet, sweetheart. We're just talking about some people who want to meet you." "I don't want to leave," Jamie whispered, his fingers white-knuckled around his sketchbook. "Listen to me," Maggie said, her voice steady despite her churning emotions. "Nothing is happening right now. We're going to figure this out together, okay?" Grace approached them, her expression sympathetic. "Maggie, maybe you should meet with Sarah and Todd first. See where they're at, what their intentions are." Maggie nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. She needed to understand these people who had suddenly reappeared in Jamie's life. Were they truly ready to be parents? Could they provide the stability and support Jamie desperately needed? That evening, as stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Maggie sat on the edge of Jamie's bed. His room had become a gallery of his drawings, scenes of both darkness and light, fear and hope. Jamie gripped her arm tightly, his eyes searching her face. "No matter what happens," she promised, "I'm here for you." Jamie nodded but didn't loosen his grip, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. The morning light cast long shadows across Maggie's kitchen as she straightened her blouse for the third time. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured her coffee, spilling a few drops on the counter. Jamie watched her from his usual spot at the table, his dark eyes following her nervous movements. "Are you scared?" he asked softly, his pencil pausing mid-stroke on his latest drawing. Maggie turned to him, forcing a smile. "Not scared, sweetheart, just thinking hard about some important things." She wiped the coffee drops with a paper towel, buying time to steady her voice. "I'm meeting some people today who knew you when you were very little." Jamie's grip tightened on his pencil. "My old mom and dad?" "Yes," Maggie answered honestly, sitting beside him. "They want to talk about how they've been trying to make things better." At Grace's office, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Maggie waited. When Sarah and Todd Miller walked in, she was struck by how ordinary they looked. Sarah in a neat cardigan, Todd wearing pressed khakis and a button-down shirt. Their faces showed the strain of their journey, but their eyes held determination. Grace gestured everyone to sit, her presence calm and professional. "Thank you all for coming today. We're here to have an open discussion about Jamie's future." Sarah spoke first, her voice wavering. "We've made terrible mistakes," she admitted, pulling out a tissue from her purse. "The drugs, they took everything from us. Our home, our dignity, our beautiful boy." She dabbed at her eyes. "But we've worked so hard to change." Todd reached for his wife's hand. "We completed the New Horizons rehabilitation program," he explained, sliding certificates across the table. "I've held my job at the construction company for 7 months now. We've got a 2-bedroom apartment in a good school district." Maggie listened, her face neutral despite the emotions churning inside. "Can you tell me about your support system? What happens if things get difficult again?" "We attend meetings 3 times a week," Sarah answered quickly. "Our sponsor, Mike, he's been clean for 15 years. He's helped us understand what we need to do differently." "And therapy?" Maggie pressed. "Jamie's been through severe trauma. Have you considered how that might affect him, and you, as a family?" Todd shifted in his chair. "We're both seeing counselors. We know it won't be easy, but we're committed to doing whatever it takes." Grace interjected gently. "The court will need to see evidence of long-term stability and a clear plan for addressing Jamie's specific needs." The conversation continued, with Sarah and Todd sharing more details about their recovery journey. They spoke of shame, of determination, of hopes for redemption. Their words seemed sincere, their remorse palpable. As the meeting concluded, Maggie gathered her notes, her mind racing. The Millers' story of recovery was compelling, their desire to reconnect with Jamie apparent. Yet she couldn't shake the image of Jamie's haunting drawings, the fear in his eyes when startled, the long journey of healing still ahead. Walking to her car, Maggie found herself wondering if good intentions and 7 months of sobriety were enough to ensure Jamie's safety and happiness. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her shoulders. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Maggie spread Jamie's drawings across her dining room table. Each sketch told a piece of his story, from the dark, haunting images of his early days at Oak Hill to the more recent ones showing glimpses of hope and safety. Her fingers traced the progression, noting how his lines had grown steadier, his scenes less shadowed. "Oh, Jamie," she whispered, picking up a particularly detailed drawing of the hidden room. The precision in his artwork broke her heart. No child should remember such a place with such clarity. Tom arrived mid-morning carrying 2 cups of coffee from the local diner. He settled into a chair beside Maggie, studying the artwork laid out before them. "These tell quite a story," he said softly, careful not to wake Jamie, who was still sleeping upstairs. "The court needs to understand what returning him too quickly could mean." Maggie nodded, pushing back tears. "I know his parents are trying, Tom, but Jamie's just starting to feel safe. Look at these newer drawings. There's actual color in them now. He's beginning to heal." "Then that's what we focus on," Tom replied, pulling out his notebook. "We document his progress, show the court concrete evidence of his emotional growth. It's not about denying his parents' rights. It's about ensuring Jamie's well-being comes first." Later that afternoon, Jamie sat cross-legged on the living room floor, working on a new drawing. Maggie joined him, sitting quietly until he looked up at her. "Jamie," she began gently, "I wanted to talk to you about your mom and dad. They've been working very hard to get better." Jamie's hand stilled over his paper. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Do they love me now?" Maggie's heart clenched. She moved closer, careful not to crowd him. "Sweetie, they've always loved you. Sometimes grown-ups have big problems that make it hard for them to take care of the people they love. Your parents needed to fix those problems first." Jamie nodded slowly, processing her words. His small fingers tightened around his pencil as he began drawing again. Maggie watched as 3 figures emerged on the paper, a child in the center, a woman she recognized as herself, and 2 more adults standing slightly apart. "Is that your family?" she asked softly. Jamie nodded again, adding careful details to each figure. The adults at a distance, his parents, weren't drawn with the same dark lines as his earlier sketches. Instead, they appeared uncertain, faded but present. As evening approached, Jamie grew tired, his head nodding over his artwork. Maggie gathered him into her arms, feeling his small body relax against her. He clutched his latest drawing as he drifted off to sleep, the paper crinkling slightly in his grip. The 3 figures on the page seemed to watch them, a visual representation of Jamie's complicated reality, where love and fear, hope and uncertainty all existed together. The morning of the hearing arrived with a heavy silence. Maggie helped Jamie straighten his collar, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed down his shirt. The courthouse seemed more imposing than ever, its marble columns casting long shadows in the early light. Inside the courtroom, Jamie gripped his notebook tightly as they made their way to their seats. Across the aisle, Sarah and Todd sat nervously, both looking better than Maggie remembered from their previous meeting. Sarah's hair was neatly styled, her clothes clean and pressed. Todd wore a tie, though he kept fidgeting with it. Judge Hayes entered, and the room fell silent. "We're here today," he began, his voice steady and clear, "to evaluate the petition for custody of James Wilson by his biological parents, Sarah and Todd Wilson." Sarah took the stand first, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I know I failed Jamie," she said, her voice cracking. "The drugs, they took over everything. I couldn't see past my next fix, couldn't see how much I was hurting my baby." Tears streamed down her face as she described her journey through rehabilitation. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I did it for Jamie. I want to be the mother he deserves." Todd's testimony followed, his voice steady but strained. "I've secured a good job at the manufacturing plant," he explained. "We have a 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood, near a good school. I'm making enough to support us with savings for emergencies." He detailed his attendance at parenting classes and family therapy sessions. When questioned about Jamie's trauma, Sarah spoke about finding a local therapist, while Todd mentioned creating a quiet space for Jamie in their new home. Their answers showed care, but lacked understanding of the depth of Jamie's emotional needs. Maggie's heart raced as she took the stand. She described Jamie's progress, from his first terrified night at her home to his recent breakthrough in therapy. Jamie communicates through his art, she explained, holding up a series of his drawings. These early ones show his fear, his isolation. But look at his recent work. There's hope here, trust beginning to grow. She detailed their daily routines, the safety measures she'd implemented, and the network of support she'd built around Jamie. He needs consistency right now, she emphasized. Every small change can trigger his trauma responses. He's just starting to believe he's truly safe. Throughout the testimonies, Jamie sat quietly, his pencil moving across his notebook. Occasionally, he would glance up at his parents, then back at Maggie, his expression unreadable. Judge Hayes listened intently, asking pointed questions about Sarah and Todd's support systems, their understanding of trauma-informed parenting, and their plans for maintaining Jamie's current therapeutic relationships. As the hearing drew to a close, Judge Hayes announced, "I'll be ordering a thorough investigation into the Wilsons' current situation before making my final ruling. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks." Outside the courtroom, Jamie tugged at Maggie's sleeve. "Do I have to leave you?" His voice barely audible. Maggie knelt down to his level, meeting his worried eyes. "I'll fight for you no matter what," she promised, her voice firm despite the uncertainty weighing on her heart. The morning sun filtered through Maggie's kitchen window as she sorted through her mail. Bills, advertisements, and then, her hands froze on a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside, she found a crudely typed note that made her blood run cold. "Back off from the custody case or you'll regret it. This is your only warning." Her hands shook as she immediately called the police. Within an hour, 2 officers sat at her kitchen table, carefully placing the letter in an evidence bag while taking her statement. Jamie watched from the doorway, his notebook clutched tightly against his chest. "We'll dust this for prints," Officer Martinez assured her. "In the meantime, document any suspicious activity and call us immediately if you receive more threats." After the police left, Maggie called Grace, who arrived within minutes. "This isn't uncommon in heated custody cases," Grace said, examining a copy of the letter. "But we need to take it seriously." They called Judge Hayes' office together. His clerk immediately put them through, and the judge listened gravely to their report. "I'm noting this in the case file," he said firmly. "Ms. Bell, please keep me informed of any developments." Throughout the afternoon, Maggie threw herself into securing her home. She called a locksmith who installed new deadbolts on all the doors. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, agreed to keep watch and gave Maggie her cell phone number for emergencies. "I'll check in regularly," Mrs. Chen promised, her kind eyes crinkling with concern. "Maybe bring over some of my famous dumplings, too. You both look like you could use some comfort food." Jamie hadn't left Maggie's side all day, following her from room to room like a silent shadow. As she finished testing the new locks, he tugged gently on her sleeve. "Are the bad people coming?" he whispered, his first words since the police visit. Maggie knelt down to his level, her heart aching at the fear in his eyes. "We're being extra careful," she said, pulling him into a tight hug. "But you're safe here with me. I promise." Grace stopped by again that evening with groceries and a new security camera for the front door. As they set it up, she squeezed Maggie's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing," she assured her. "Don't let them intimidate you." But even with all the precautions in place, Maggie couldn't shake the creeping sensation of being watched. Every passing car seemed suspicious. Every shadow held potential threats. She tried to maintain a calm demeanor for Jamie's sake, but her nerves were frayed. That night, after Jamie had fallen asleep, Maggie sat in the chair beside his bed. His face was peaceful in sleep, one hand still gripping his ever-present notebook. The streetlight outside cast a gentle glow through his window. "I'll keep you safe," she whispered softly, "no matter what it takes." And sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Maggie prepared her morning coffee. The threatening letter from yesterday still weighed heavily on her mind, but seeing Jamie at the kitchen table, focused intently on his drawing, brought her a sense of peace. His pencil moved deliberately across the paper, each stroke careful and purposeful. When he finished, Jamie slid the drawing across the table to her. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. The sketch showed her standing tall, arms spread wide, protecting a small figure that was clearly Jamie from looming dark shapes in the background. The detail was remarkable. She could see determination in her drawn face, and Jamie had captured the protective stance perfectly. "Is this how you see me?" Maggie asked softly. Jamie nodded, adding a few final touches to the shadows. Her phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was Grace. "The police are taking the threat seriously," Grace explained. "They've assigned Detective Roberts to oversee the investigation. He's experienced with cases involving child welfare." Maggie walked to the living room, keeping Jamie in sight. "Any leads?" "Nothing concrete yet, but they're analyzing the letter for prints and tracking the paper type. Listen, Maggie, about the custody hearing next week. We need to be prepared. Have you organized Jamie's drawings?" "I've been working on it," Maggie replied. "I've arranged them chronologically, showing his progression since coming here. The early ones are difficult to look at, but his recent work shows real healing." Grace hummed in agreement. "That timeline could be powerful evidence. It shows not just what he experienced, but how he's processing it now." After hanging up, Maggie sat beside Jamie at the table. "Remember how we talked about the hearing next week?" she asked gently. Jamie's pencil stilled. "The judge might want to see your drawings. Would that be okay?" Jamie's shoulders tensed slightly, but he met her eyes and gave a small nod. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to," Maggie assured him. "Your art speaks for itself." She spread out some of his drawings on the table, the dark ones from his first days with her, the hidden room at Oak Hill, and his newer works showing glimpses of hope and safety. Jamie touched each one carefully, as if reconnecting with the memories they contained. That evening, as Maggie tucked Jamie into bed, she noticed he'd taped his latest drawing, the one of her protecting him, to his bedside wall. "You're braver than you think, Jamie," she said softly, smoothing his hair. Jamie looked up at her, his eyes bright in the dim light. "Because you're here," he whispered, his voice barely audible but full of trust. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as Maggie and Jamie entered, their footsteps echoing on the polished floor. Jamie's small hand gripped Maggie's tightly, his knuckles white with tension. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden benches where Sarah and Todd sat, their faces drawn with anxiety. Judge Hayes entered, his black robe sweeping behind him as he took his seat. The room fell silent. "This hearing," he began, his voice firm but compassionate, "will determine what's best for Jamie. Nothing else matters today, not adult pride, not past mistakes, only what will give this child the safety and stability he deserves." Sarah spoke first, her voice trembling as she described her journey through rehabilitation. "I know I failed Jamie," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Every day in recovery, his face was what kept me going. We've prepared a room for him, filled it with books and toys." Todd nodded beside her, adding details about his new job at a construction company and their 2-bedroom apartment in a good school district. Maggie felt Jamie's grip tighten as his parents spoke. His eyes remained fixed on the floor, his shoulders tense. When Sarah described their plans for family counseling, Jamie shifted closer to Maggie, pressing against her arm. When Maggie's turn came, she approached the bench with a carefully organized portfolio of Jamie's artwork. "Your Honor," she began, "these drawings tell Jamie's story better than any words could." She displayed them chronologically, starting with the dark, frightening images from his time at Oak Hill. "Notice the heavy lines, the shadowy figures," she explained, her voice steady. "These show us Jamie's fear, his isolation." The courtroom grew still as she moved through the timeline, showing how Jamie's artwork had evolved. "Here," she pointed to a recent drawing. "You can see hope beginning to emerge. The windows have light now. The figures are less threatening." She described each subtle change, each sign of healing she'd witnessed. Jamie sat perfectly still, watching as Maggie shared his journey through his art. When Judge Hayes asked if he wanted to add anything, Jamie hesitated. Maggie gave him an encouraging smile. He stood slowly, pointing to one particular drawing, a warm, welcoming house with light streaming from its windows. His voice, though barely above a whisper, carried clearly in the silent courtroom. "This is where I feel safe." Sarah let out a quiet sob at Jamie's words. Todd placed his hand on her shoulder, his own eyes glistening. Judge Hayes studied Jamie's face carefully, then looked at the drawing he'd indicated. "Thank you all for your testimony," Judge Hayes announced, gathering his notes. "This is not a decision to be made lightly. I will review everything presented today and deliver my ruling tomorrow morning at 9. The gavel struck, its sharp crack making Jamie jump slightly. As they left the courtroom, Jamie's hand remained firmly in Maggie's. His steps were uncertain, matching the mix of hope and worry that Maggie felt in her own heart. The morning sun had shifted, filling the courthouse hallway with warm light as they made their way toward the exit. The morning sun streamed through Maggie's kitchen window as she prepared Jamie's favorite breakfast, golden brown pancakes with fresh strawberries. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured the batter, her mind racing with thoughts about the upcoming ruling. The call from the courthouse had come early, the clerk's voice professional but kind as she requested their presence. "Jamie, sweetheart," Maggie called softly up the stairs. "Time for breakfast." She heard his quiet footsteps padding down, noticed how he clutched his sketchbook close to his chest, his constant companion through all of this. Jamie's face was pale, his eyes wide with worry as he settled at the kitchen table. Maggie placed a warm plate in front of him, sitting beside him rather than across. "Whatever happens today," she said gently, "we'll face it together." The courthouse loomed before them an hour later, its brick facade both familiar and imposing. Jamie's grip on Maggie's hand tightened as they climbed the steps. Inside, the polished floors echoed their footsteps as they made their way to the courtroom. Sarah and Todd were already seated when they entered, both looking nervous but composed. They offered small, uncertain smiles to Jamie, who partially hid behind Maggie. The room filled quickly with the others involved in the case: Grace, Tom, and various court officials. Judge Hayes entered, his presence commanding immediate silence. He adjusted his glasses, looking thoughtfully at the papers before him before raising his eyes to address the room. "After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony presented," he began, his voice clear and measured, "I have reached my decision regarding the custody of Jamie." He paused, his gaze moving between all parties involved. "While I commend Sarah and Todd for their significant progress in rehabilitation and their sincere efforts to rebuild their lives, my primary concern must be Jamie's current well-being and continued recovery." Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. "The evidence clearly shows that under Ms. Bell's care, Jamie has found stability, safety, and the ability to begin processing his trauma in a healthy way." Maggie felt tears welling in her eyes as the judge continued. "Therefore, I am granting permanent custody to Margaret Bell, with provisions for supervised visitation rights for Sarah and Todd, to be gradually increased as deemed appropriate by the court and Jamie's therapist." Jamie's small hand squeezed Maggie's tightly as relief washed over them both. A single tear rolled down Maggie's cheek as she looked down at him, finding a small but genuine smile on his face, the first she'd seen in days. To her surprise, Sarah and Todd approached them after the ruling. Sarah's eyes were wet with tears, but her voice was steady as she spoke. "Thank you, Ms. Bell, for taking care of our son when we couldn't, for giving him what we failed to provide." Todd nodded in agreement, adding softly, "We're grateful he found someone like you." As they left the courthouse, Jamie suddenly wrapped his arms around Maggie's waist, holding tight. "I knew you wouldn't let me go," he whispered into her sweater. Maggie's voice caught in her throat as she replied through happy tears. "Never, Jamie. Never." The morning light filtered through the art room windows as Jamie settled into his new routine at the community center. Maggie watched from the doorway as he carefully arranged his colored pencils, his movements more relaxed than she'd seen in months. The art instructor, Ms. Chen, approached each child with gentle encouragement, and Jamie's shoulders gradually loosened as he began to draw. "He's doing wonderfully," Ms. Chen whispered to Maggie. "He has a natural talent for expressing emotion through his artwork." Maggie nodded, her heart swelling with pride as she watched Jamie concentrate on his paper. his tongue slightly sticking out in focus. Later that afternoon, they arrived at the Family Services Center for Jamie's first supervised visit with Sarah and Todd. The visiting room was painted in soft blues and greens, with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. Jamie gripped Maggie's hand tightly as they entered, but his eyes showed curiosity rather than fear. Sarah and Todd sat nervously on the couch, a worn photo album resting between them. "Hi, Jamie," Sarah said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "We brought something to share with you." Jamie looked up at Maggie, who gave him an encouraging nod. He slowly walked over and perched on the edge of the couch, leaving space between himself and his parents. Sarah opened the album with shaking hands, revealing a photo of a tiny baby wrapped in a blue blanket. "That's you on the day you were born," Todd explained, his voice thick with emotion. "You were so small, but you had the strongest grip on my finger." Jamie leaned forward slightly, studying the image. "Was I crying?" he asked quietly, his first words to his parents in months. "No," Sarah smiled through tears. "You were so calm, just looking around at everything with those big eyes of yours." As they continued through the album, Jamie's questions came more frequently. "Where was that?" he'd ask, pointing to a park in one photo. "What was my favorite toy?" When seeing himself clutching a stuffed elephant. Maggie observed from her chair by the window, her heart aching with a complex mixture of emotions. She saw how Sarah's hand steadied as she turned each page, how Todd's voice grew more confident as he shared stories. Most importantly, she noticed how Jamie's body language slowly shifted from rigid caution to genuine interest. The social worker supervising the visit, Ms. Rodriguez, made quiet notes while maintaining a watchful presence. She caught Maggie's eye occasionally, giving subtle nods of approval at how the interaction was progressing. After the visit, Jamie was unusually quiet on the drive home. He held the small scrapbook Sarah had made for him, a carefully curated selection of photos she'd given him to keep. His fingers traced the cover repeatedly, lost in thought. That evening, Jamie sat at his usual spot at the kitchen table, his art supplies spread out before him. Maggie noticed he worked with particular care on this drawing, selecting his colors thoughtfully. When he finally showed her the finished piece, a group portrait of all of them together, Maggie felt tears prick at her eyes. "This is how I want it to be," Jamie said softly, his voice full of hope and uncertainty. Maggie wrapped her arms around him, whispering, "It's a beautiful start." The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Maggie helped Jamie pack his art supplies into his favorite blue backpack. His fingers traced the edges of the drawing he'd worked on all week, a carefully crafted scene showing him with Sarah and Todd at the park, complete with fluffy clouds and a bright yellow sun. "Do you think they'll like it?" Jamie asked, his voice small but hopeful. He'd spent hours getting the details just right, even adding tiny flowers in the grass. "They'll love it, sweetheart," Maggie assured him, zipping up the backpack. She noticed how his shoulders weren't as tense as they'd been before the first visit. Small steps forward, she reminded herself. At the Family Services Center, Sarah and Todd were already waiting in the visiting room. Jamie clutched his drawing behind his back, suddenly shy. Maggie gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder, and he stepped forward. "I made this for you," he said, holding out the picture with slightly trembling hands. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she took in every detail. "Oh, Jamie," she whispered, tracing the figures with her finger. "It's beautiful." Todd cleared his throat, clearly emotional. "You're really talented, son. Thank you for sharing this with us." The social worker, Ms. Rodriguez, suggested they move their visit to the adjacent park. The autumn air was crisp and clean as they walked together to the playground. Jamie hung back at first, staying close to Maggie, but Todd's gentle invitation to try the swings drew him out. "Want me to push you?" Todd asked, and Jamie nodded, climbing onto the swing. Soon, the air was filled with Jamie's laughter as he soared higher and higher. Maggie watched from a nearby bench, her heart full but vigilant. She observed how Sarah clapped and cheered for Jamie, how Todd was careful not to push too high, how Jamie's smile grew more genuine with each passing minute. When Jamie took a break from swinging, Sarah pulled out a small paper bag. "I brought some animal crackers. They used to be your favorite when you were little." Jamie's eyes lit up with recognition as he took one. and they sat together on a picnic blanket sharing the treats. The visit passed quickly, filled with small moments of connection. As it drew to a close, Sarah hugged Jamie gently, promising to bring more photos next time. "I found some pictures of your first birthday," she said. "Would you like to see those?" Jamie nodded, clutching the scrapbook she'd given him during their last visit. His eyes met Maggie's across the playground, seeking reassurance, and she smiled warmly. On the drive home, Jamie was quiet but peaceful, occasionally flipping through the scrapbook pages. After dinner, as they sat together on the couch, he looked up at Maggie thoughtfully. "I think they're trying really hard," he said, his voice soft but steady. Maggie pulled him close, her heart full of love for this brave, resilient boy. "That's because they love you, Jamie. And so do I." The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Maggie helped Jamie pack his art supplies into his favorite blue backpack. His fingers traced the edges of the drawing he'd worked on all week, a carefully crafted scene showing him with Sarah and Todd at the park, complete with fluffy clouds and a bright yellow sun. Maggie noticed how his hands trembled slightly, a mix of excitement and nervousness evident in his movements. "Do you think they'll like it?" Jamie whispered, his voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the kitchen clock. "They'll love it, sweetheart," Maggie assured him, gently zipping up the backpack. "Your art always tells such beautiful stories." At the park, the autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Sarah and Todd waited on a wooden bench. Their faces lit up when they spotted Jamie, but they remained seated, letting him approach at his own pace. Maggie gave Jamie's shoulder a gentle squeeze of encouragement. Jamie pulled the drawing from his backpack with careful movements. His small feet shuffled forward as he held out the paper to his parents. Sarah's hands shook as she took it, and tears immediately welled in her eyes. Todd leaned in close, his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Oh, Jamie," Sarah breathed, her finger tracing the careful lines. "It's beautiful." "You drew us all together," Todd added, his voice thick with emotion. "Look at all the details. Even the clouds have smiling faces." Jamie's shoulders relaxed slightly at their reaction. A tiny smile tugged at the corners of his mouth as he pointed to different parts of the drawing, explaining each element in soft, short sentences. Maggie watched from a nearby bench, her heart swelling with pride at his courage. The afternoon unfolded naturally after that. Todd guided Jamie to the swings, his strong hands giving gentle pushes that sent Jamie soaring toward the clouds. For the first time, Maggie heard Jamie laugh, a pure, clear sound that seemed to brighten the entire park. Sarah watched them, clutching the drawing to her chest, occasionally wiping away tears. Maggie maintained her vigilant position, ready to step in if needed, but Jamie seemed to grow more comfortable with each passing minute. He showed Sarah how high he could pump his legs on the swing, and even let Todd help him across the monkey bars. The tension that usually held his small body rigid gradually melted away. As their time drew to a close, Sarah pulled out a worn photo album from her bag. "I brought some pictures from when you were a baby," she said softly. "Would you like to see them next time?" Jamie nodded, his eyes fixed on the album's cover. Sarah hugged him gently, and this time Jamie didn't stiffen at her touch. "I'll bring more next time, sweetheart," she promised, her voice wavering slightly. The drive home was quiet but peaceful. Jamie held the photo album in his lap, occasionally running his fingers over its leather cover. That evening, as Maggie tucked him into bed, he looked up at her with clear eyes. "I think they're trying really hard," he said quietly, his voice thoughtful. Maggie smiled warmly, adjusting his blanket. "That's because they love you, Jamie, and so do I." Maggie spent the morning tidying her home, arranging art supplies on the kitchen table, and taking deep breaths to calm her nerves. This visit felt different, more intimate than their meetings at the park or supervised center. Jamie helped her set up his drawing materials, carefully arranging colored pencils in rainbow order. "Do you think they'll like our house?" Jamie asked, straightening a stack of blank paper for the 10th time. "I'm sure they will," Maggie replied, though her stomach fluttered with uncertainty. "And they'll love seeing where you create your beautiful art." When Sarah and Todd arrived, the initial moments were awkward. They stood in the entryway, taking in the family photos and Jamie's artwork that decorated the walls. Jamie grabbed Sarah's hand and led her to the kitchen table where his community art project lay spread out, a large canvas depicting his journey from darkness to light. "See, this part shows where I was scared," Jamie explained, pointing to shadowy figures in the background. "But over here, it gets brighter because that's when Maggie found me." Sarah listened intently, adding small details to the background as Jamie directed. Her hands moved carefully, following his instructions with genuine interest. Todd sat nearby, sharing stories that made Jamie's eyes light up with wonder. "You wouldn't believe how fast you could crawl," Todd chuckled. "Once you scooted right under the kitchen table and refused to come out until we brought you your favorite stuffed penguin." Jamie laughed, a sound that filled Maggie's heart with joy and an edge of bittersweet emotion. From her spot in the kitchen, she arranged cookies on a plate while watching their interactions. The scene before her was everything she'd hoped for Jamie, loving parents working to rebuild their relationship with their son, yet she couldn't ignore the slight ache in her chest, knowing that as their bonds grew stronger, her role would naturally shift. "Maggie," Jamie called out suddenly, "can we take a picture together? All of us?" The request caught her off guard. She hesitated, not wanting to intrude on their family moment, but Jamie's eager face made it impossible to refuse. They gathered in front of the living room window, where afternoon sunlight created a warm glow. Jamie positioned himself between Maggie and Sarah, while Todd stood behind them. "Everyone smile," Jamie commanded as Sarah held up her phone to take the photo. The resulting image captured something beautiful. 4 people coming together for Jamie's sake, their smiles genuine despite the complex emotions beneath the surface. Jamie immediately asked to see the photo, pointing out how happy everyone looked. Later, as Maggie placed the framed photo on her mantel, Jamie stood beside her with satisfaction written across his face. "Now we all fit together," he declared proudly. Maggie wrapped her arms around him, whispering, "Always." The word carried the weight of her promise, to remain a constant in his life while supporting his relationship with Sarah and Todd, no matter how their roles might change. The morning of the advocacy event dawned bright and crisp. Maggie stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting her blazer for the 10th time. Her hands trembled slightly as she rehearsed her opening lines. The invitation from the Foster Care Alliance had arrived 2 weeks ago, requesting her to share her experiences as a testament to the power of dedicated advocacy. In the kitchen, Jamie sat at the table, carefully organizing his drawings that would accompany Maggie's presentation. He looked up as Maggie entered, immediately noticing her nervous energy. "What if I mess up?" Maggie asked, more to herself than to Jamie. Jamie put down his drawings and walked over to her. "You tell my story better than anyone," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers with complete trust. The conference center buzzed with activity as Maggie and Jamie arrived. Social workers, foster parents, and advocates filled the rows of seats. Jamie helped set up his drawings on easels beside the podium, each one telling a piece of their journey together. When it was time for Maggie to speak, she gripped the podium tightly, her eyes finding Jamie in the front row. He held up a handmade sign that read, "Thank you, Maggie," in careful block letters decorated with colorful stars. Taking a deep breath, Maggie began sharing their story. She described finding Jamie in that courtroom, his silent plea for help, and the journey they'd taken together. As she spoke, she gestured to Jamie's drawings, showing the progression from dark, frightening images to ones filled with hope and light. "These drawings aren't just art," Maggie explained, her voice growing stronger. "They're a child's voice when words failed him. They're evidence of trauma, yes, but also of healing. Every child in the system has a story to tell. We just need to learn how to listen." The audience sat transfixed as Maggie detailed their battles in court, the discovery of corruption at Oak Hill, and the gradual process of building trust. She spoke about the importance of stability, of fighting for what's right even when faced with threats and opposition. "Change doesn't happen in courtrooms alone," she continued. "It happens in living rooms, at kitchen tables, in the quiet moments when a child finally feels safe enough to share their truth." After her speech, people lined up to speak with her. A woman with tears in her eyes shared how she'd been considering becoming a foster parent but had been afraid. "Your story gave me courage," she told Maggie. Others shared similar stories, of children they'd helped, of systems they were fighting to change, of hope they'd found in unexpected places. Jamie stayed close to Maggie's side, proudly explaining his drawings to anyone who asked. As the event wound down, Maggie sat with Jamie in the now quiet conference room. The evening sun cast long shadows across his drawings, still displayed on their easels. "We've come so far together," Maggie said softly, looking at the progression of his art. Jamie nodded, his eyes bright. "And we're not done yet." Maggie smiled, knowing their journey was just beginning. Weeks stretched into a blur of creative energy as Jamie devoted himself to his community showcase project. Every afternoon after school, he would spread his art supplies across Maggie's dining room table, meticulously working on sections of his mural. Maggie made sure he had everything he needed: fresh brushes, vibrant paints, and, most importantly, the emotional space to express himself freely. The mural took shape gradually, like a story unfolding piece by piece. Jamie started with the darker sections, using deep blues and purples to create shadowy corners that represented his past fears. His small hands worked carefully, adding layers of detail that spoke volumes about his experiences. Maggie noticed how he would sometimes pause, lost in thought, before continuing with renewed determination. As the weeks progressed, the mural transformed. The darkness gave way to streams of golden light, created with careful brushstrokes of yellow and orange. Jamie painted figures holding hands, a larger one leading a smaller one, walking through various scenes. Each scene showed a different stage of healing: a warm home, a supportive classroom, a peaceful garden. The symbolism wasn't lost on Maggie, who often found herself blinking back tears as she watched him work. On Showcase Day, the community center buzzed with excitement. Jamie's mural commanded attention, spanning an entire wall with its powerful journey from darkness to light. He stood beside it, wearing his favorite blue shirt, explaining his work to visitors with growing confidence. "The dark parts," he told an elderly couple, "that's what being scared feels like. But see how the light comes in?" He pointed to the golden streams breaking through the shadows. "That's what happens when someone helps you feel safe." Sarah and Todd arrived mid-morning, their faces lighting up when they saw Jamie's creation. They listened intently as he explained each section, nodding with understanding and wiping away occasional tears. Their presence, once a source of anxiety, now added another layer of support to Jamie's special day. Throughout the afternoon, visitors gathered around the mural, many visibly moved by its message. Some shared their own stories of healing, while others simply stood in quiet appreciation. Jamie answered questions thoughtfully, growing more comfortable with each interaction. Mr. Daniels gathered everyone's attention around 2 o'clock. His voice carried across the room as he announced that Jamie's mural would become a permanent installation in the community center's main hall. "This piece," he explained, "captures the essence of hope and healing. It will continue to inspire and comfort others for years to come." Jamie's face glowed with pride as applause filled the room. He looked at Maggie, his eyes shining with joy and accomplishment. The boy who once couldn't speak now stood tall, his art giving voice to not only his story, but to the universal journey of finding light in the darkness. That evening, as they sat together on their favorite couch, Jamie turned to Maggie. "I think I helped people today," he said softly. Maggie smiled warmly, her heart full of pride. "You help people every day, Jamie." Weeks passed like brushstrokes on canvas as Jamie poured his heart into the community showcase project. Each day after school, he would carefully arrange his art supplies across Maggie's dining room table. Fresh brushes lined up like soldiers, paint bottles clustered by color, and his cherished sketchbook always within reach. Maggie made sure he had everything he needed, from extra canvas to his favorite snacks, creating a nurturing environment where his creativity could flourish. The mural slowly emerged, telling a story that words alone couldn't capture. Jamie started with the darker sections, using deep blues and purples to create shadowy corners that represented his past fears. His small hands worked with surprising precision, adding layers of detail that spoke volumes about his experiences. Sometimes he would pause, lost in thought, and Maggie would quietly refill his water cup or adjust the lighting, giving him space to process his emotions through art. As the weeks progressed, the mural transformed. The darkness gradually gave way to warmer colors, soft yellows, gentle oranges, and finally, brilliant golds. Jamie painted a child figure holding hands with a taller guardian, their silhouettes walking through scenes that evolved from threatening shadows to peaceful landscapes. Each element held meaning, broken chains becoming butterflies, barred windows opening to reveal sunlight, and thorny vines blooming into flowers. On the day of the showcase, the community center buzzed with excitement. Jamie stood beside his mural, wearing his favorite blue sweater and a tentative smile. As visitors approached, he found his voice, quietly at first, then with growing confidence as he explained the symbolism in his work. "This dark part," he said, pointing to the beginning of the mural, "is what being scared feels like. But then..." His finger traced the path to brighter sections. "This is what happens when someone helps you feel safe." Sarah and Todd arrived, their eyes widening as they took in the scale and depth of Jamie's creation. Sarah wiped away tears as she listened to her son describe his journey, while Todd stood quietly, his hand on her shoulder, both clearly moved by Jamie's artistic expression of his path to healing. The community's response was overwhelming. Teachers, social workers, and local artists praised not just Jamie's technique, but the emotional truth captured in his work. Several visitors shared their own stories of fostering and adoption, creating a ripple of connection through the room. Mr. Daniels, the art program leader, gathered everyone's attention with a gentle tap on his glass. His announcement that Jamie's mural would become a permanent installation at the community center brought spontaneous applause. Jamie's face lit up with surprise and joy, his eyes seeking out Maggie in the crowd. That evening, as they drove home, Jamie sat quietly in the back seat, still processing the day's events. "I think I helped people today," he said softly, looking at his paint-stained fingers. Maggie caught his eye in the rearview mirror, her heart full of pride. "You help people every day, Jamie," she replied, her voice warm with affection. The morning of the advocacy event dawned bright and clear, matching Jamie's excited energy as he carefully packed his portfolio of drawings. Maggie watched him sort through his sketches with practiced care, his confidence a far cry from the silent, frightened boy who first entered her home. She helped him select the most powerful pieces, from his early dark drawings to his recent vibrant works, each telling a chapter of their shared journey. "Are you nervous?" Maggie asked, straightening Jamie's collar. Jamie shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. "Not with you there," he replied, clutching his favorite sketchbook. The conference center buzzed with activity as they arrived. Social workers, foster parents, and child advocates filled the auditorium, their conversations creating a gentle hum of anticipation. Maggie felt Jamie's hand slip into hers as they made their way backstage, where other speakers were preparing their presentations. When their turn came, Maggie stepped up to the podium with Jamie beside her, his artwork displayed on the screen behind them. She began their story, her voice steady and clear, describing the day she first noticed Jamie's silent struggles at Oak Hill. As she spoke, Jamie carefully held up each corresponding drawing, the images adding powerful depth to her words. "But this isn't just my story to tell," Maggie said, turning to Jamie with an encouraging smile. Jamie stepped forward, his voice soft but determined. "These drawings helped me when I couldn't talk," he explained, pointing to an early sketch filled with shadows. "Maggie listened even when I didn't have words. She made me feel safe enough to trust again." The audience sat in rapt attention as Jamie continued, describing how art became his voice and Maggie his anchor. He showed them his community mural sketch, explaining how it represented his journey from darkness to light. "Now I know what family really means," Jamie said, his voice growing stronger. "It's about love and safety and believing in someone even when they're scared." Tears glistened in many eyes as the audience rose to their feet, applauding Jamie's courage and Maggie's dedication. After the presentation, families gathered around them, sharing their own stories and asking questions about fostering. One couple with tears in their eyes told Jamie his story had finally given them the courage to begin their fostering journey. A social worker approached them, explaining how she planned to use art therapy with her young clients after seeing the power of Jamie's drawings. Others asked about starting similar programs in their communities, inspired by the transformation they witnessed. Jamie stood tall beside Maggie, answering questions and showing his artwork with growing confidence. His eyes shone with pride as he explained his drawings to interested listeners, each sharing how his story touched their hearts. That evening, as they drove home under a sky painted with sunset colors, Jamie turned to Maggie. "I think we're helping other kids find families," he said thoughtfully. Maggie hugged him tightly and replied, "We are, Jamie. We really are." The gallery buzzed with anticipation as visitors gathered for the opening of Voices of Change. Soft lighting illuminated the carefully curated artwork, but all eyes were drawn to the centerpiece, Jamie's mural, Hope in Silence. The piece dominated the main wall, its progression from darkness to light capturing viewers' attention immediately. Maggie stood back watching Jamie confidently guide a small group through his artistic journey. His voice, once silenced by trauma, now carried clearly through the gallery space as he explained each element of his work. "These shadows here," he pointed to the darker section, "show how scared and alone I felt. But see how the light starts coming in? That's when things began to change." The visitors nodded, captivated by both the artwork and its young creator's insight. Jamie's demeanor showed no trace of the frightened boy who once communicated only through sketches. He stood tall, his eyes bright with purpose as he shared his story. Sarah and Todd arrived, their faces beaming with pride as they watched their son engage with the audience. They joined Maggie, standing quietly beside her as Jamie continued his explanations. The three adults exchanged knowing looks, acknowledging how far they'd all come together. "Your son's work is remarkable," a gallery patron commented to Maggie, her eyes misty with emotion. "How did this journey begin?" Maggie smiled softly, watching Jamie demonstrate his sketching technique to an interested child. "Jamie's the real hero of this story," she explained. "He found his voice through art when words failed him. He taught me that sometimes the quietest voices have the most powerful things to say." The patron wiped away a tear as Jamie rejoined them, slipping his hand into Maggie's with natural ease. Sarah stepped forward to straighten his collar, while Todd gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder, simple gestures that spoke volumes about their growing bonds. They gathered in front of the mural, their figures silhouetted against Jamie's masterpiece. The gallery photographer captured the moment, Jamie in the center, flanked by Maggie on one side and his parents on the other, all of them smiling genuinely. The image perfectly mirrored the journey depicted in the mural behind them, from isolation to connection, from darkness to light. Visitors continued to flow through the gallery, many stopping to share their own stories of healing and hope with Jamie. His artwork had created a space where others felt safe to open up about their experiences. Maggie observed it all, her heart full as she witnessed the ripple effect of Jamie's courage. The gallery director approached them, praising Jamie's contribution to the exhibition. "Your piece speaks to so many people," she said, gesturing to the group still gathered around the mural. "It's helping others find their voice too." Jamie's eyes sparkled with pride as he looked at his family, all of them together, supporting each other, united in their love for him. The gallery lights caught the subtle details in his mural, highlighting the journey from shadows to brightness, much like their own path together. If you enjoyed the story of Robert, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.